Recently, I've been playing some Xenonauts 2. I was going to give you a full commentary on the game, going through the whole thing and commentating the campaign, because this is the perfect sort of game for a nice comfy time, looking at me having a miserable time, and cutting out all the stuff in between, because it's the kind of game where normally nothing is happening, and it's supposed to be sort of tense and stuff. Well, we can complain about that another time, but what we're going to do in this video instead, I think, is we're going to take a look at some footage from my early gameplay, and we're just going to have to say what has to be said about Xenonauts 2, because Xenonauts 2 ended up making me quite mad quite quickly, so I thought, you know what, let's just rant about it and try to take a look at what's happening with this thing. Now, to some extent, what I'm going to be talking about will only really make sense if you know what Xenonauts is. So I'm someone who's played Xenonauts 1 and came into this game with some expectation, I suppose, that this would be, in some way, an improvement on Xenonauts 1, and the big elephant in the room about Xenonauts 2 is that it doesn't improve on Xenonauts 1, or at least, if they planned to make it improve on Xenonauts 1, they didn't do it yet, because the game comes with a few criticism shields built in. The game is in early access, and in fact the footage I'm showing you is from before it even released into early access, because I happened to have access to the beta and decided to actually play it before it came out, which I very rarely do, which will give you some indication of my expectations for the game. I thought this was going to be a good time, at least for somebody watching my videos, even if I had a miserable RNG-based time along the way. So, I suppose I'll start getting into the specifics later about the design, the mechanics of this game and games that are like this, that can cause frustration, and what things I do and don't like. But before we talk about anything serious like that, we just have to point out the big issue. This game has released in an unfinished state deliberately because it's in early access, but the big issue is the game is a effective remake of the first game, but because they've released it in early access, what we've got is something that's less than the first game. So we're not even really complaining about game design here, we're complaining about the business, I suppose, side of it. Did they run out of money and decide to just release this into early access? But if they did, how are they supposed to compete with their own previous game? Xenonauts 1 is the same as Xenonauts 2. They are, for some reason, extremely similar. But Xenonauts 1 is finished, so how does Xenonauts 2 have a chance in early access? That's the sort of thing I was thinking about. And it's interesting because this game has been in development for a really long time, as I recall. I seem to remember hearing about this back whenever I played Xenonauts 1, which was, I think, like 5 years ago. I heard they were making a Xenonauts 2 and saw a few early screenshots or something. What they appear to have done, I'm going to guess here to some extent, what I think they've done, if they've taken Xenonauts 1 and they've remade it in, say, the Unreal Engine or something, or Unity I think this actually is. But what I'm left wondering is, why? What was the goal of making Xenonauts 2? What was the project supposed to be by the end of all this? Because they've taken a very long time to extremely faithfully recreate an old game in a new engine. But it's exactly the same. So why? Like, what's the advantage of playing Xenonauts 2 in the modern age? It looks like I'm playing an old sprite-based game, because while this technically is actually being rendered in 3D, it's been lovingly made such that you can't tell, and I wonder why we even needed to go down that route. I know making sprite-based graphics is supposedly really annoying, so maybe it's actually easier to make a full 3D isometric thing and just treat it like it's an old-fashioned 2D sprite-based setup, because maybe, for whatever reason, getting the art to work, getting things like moving the camera to work, is a bit easier like this. Well, I'm sure it is, but you already got it working in Xenonauts 1, so why did you even change the game engine? Like, I want to get the director of this game and say, what is this game supposed to be? I don't understand where you're going with this. You wanted to make a better version of Xenonauts 1, but you released a worse version with the promise that it would one day become a better version and have more features, and perhaps it being in this new game engine will make this easier for you to add those features. But seriously, those features needed to be added before it released, especially before it was released into early access, because you're just playing an unfinished version of Xenonauts 1 at the moment. And I'm annoyed by this because I didn't think that would be the case. When I first started playing, for the first hour or so I was pretty excited. Then after the first battle, I was like, wait a minute, this is exactly the same as Xenonauts 1. It has all of the same specific problems and things that I didn't like about it. We can talk about that a bit later. But more so than just like the detailed mechanics being the same, it's got the same setting, the same aesthetic. Every single beat in the game is a shot-for-shot remake. Even the menus seem to go out of their way to look the same as Xenonauts 1's menus. And I just thought, we needed something different. I suppose I expected something different, and the fact that I'm getting something the same has hit me harder than if I'd known in advance. Because the XCOM formula, the old school XCOM formula they're using here, it was broken when XCOM was remade. It was already old and broken years ago when it was remade by Firaxis. It really needs a lot new, I think. So we've got a spiritual successor to a game that is a spiritual successor to some old XCOM games, but the through line is that they're all the same. We need something to change. Well, maybe I'll come up with some specific ideas, but for example, at the start of this game, there's a faction called the Cleaners, and what I thought this was going to be was that before you fought the alien invasion, you had to fight to become the world government or something. There was going to be some sort of plot reason why XCOM, or Xenonauts in this case, even comes to exist and comes to be the organization that's dealing with extraterrestrial encounters. It's not like that, it's more like there's just a really hard mission at the start where you fight these guys called the Cleaners, and then that's the end of that. And you go back to it being exactly the same as Xenonauts 1 otherwise, with the odd hint that maybe something different's going to happen in the future, and the quite regular occurrence actually of text that pops up saying placeholder, or we're still working on this because it's in early access. And I'm mad, basically, because I was going to do loads with this game. I was going to write about it, I was going to make some stories, I was going to do a full game commentary, and it was revealed to me yesterday through the patch notes that the early access campaign doesn't even have an ending, so you actually can't play the whole game right now. It's early access in the unusual sense. So normally early access would be the whole game's there, but some features along the way are missing or something, because it's a sandboxy, replayable kind of game. But instead, you can play your campaign up to a certain point, but you will always just get thrown out at some point. So because this is a game where it's all positive feedback, loopy in the design, and everything is always just building up to something that's happening in the future, because we know now that we can't get past a certain part in the game, I presume anyway, maybe it will be patched in before I get there or something, it's just ultra disappointing. I feel like that's another strange decision to make. We'll release the game where you can only play a certain amount of it, so it's basically a big demo of what feels like a mod, like a UI overhaul mod of Xenonauts 1. And do you want to know my secret theory? There's a secret clue among all of Xenonauts 2's marketing that could have told you that you're actually not going to be getting a new game with this sequel. Because if you look very carefully at a lot of the logos and even some of the in-game text where the game refers to itself, it doesn't say Xenonauts 2, it says Xenonauts-2, so it's all one word. And this, to me, is a reference to how in the game, if you make, say, a fighter plane, it will be called Angel-1, and if you make another one, it's called Angel-2. So it's not like it's a sequel, it's just another one. And that is exactly what we've got with Xenonauts-2. If you were running Xenonauts 1 on your PC, and you were frustrated that you couldn't run another instance of the same .exe file, you're in luck. Xenonauts-2 is here, so now you can double play Xenonauts, get two monitors going, and play what is effectively the same game on each monitor at the same time. That's pretty neat, isn't it? No, it's not. Is that actually what's going on? Of course not, but that's what I decided was the official canon behind what I consider to be the strange decision to make what must have been quite an expensive and time-consuming, perfect remake of an old game, so perfectly remade that you don't get anything new, and it was overall an enormous waste of time. Or at least it seems like that now. Perhaps once they add more, it will prove to be an improvement, but then again, they're charging money for something you probably already have right now, and it's a bit worse overall, and it's not finished, and I'm mad. not even at the game so far, just at the business decisions around the game. We're not even looking at the moment-to-moment things that are happening, and there are things that I think could be improved there. So that was a rant. What we'll do, I think, is, well, you can go now if you like. What I'm going to do is look at some actual battles and some actual moments, and talk about Xenonauts game design, without really talking about like the campaign as if it's a continuous story like I tend to do. But I would like to do that in a separate video perhaps later, because I have played quite a lot of the game as it turns out. I've filmed a whole bunch of Xenonauts 2, I actually have to make content with it now because I don't have time to film something else. But first, let's just go in for the no context, looking at mechanics, and complain about things. And well, I think the best place to start complaining about any game that is like this, any XCOM-like, or any game that has RNG, is the RNG. This is a very heavily RNG based game, more so than XCOM, and I, as a modern gentleman, would like to put it to you that the age of RNG needs to eventually come to a close. My pet theory about RNG is that it's more acceptable the older the game is, because in the past, RNG represents something that's just really hard to develop. Like, it's really hard to make a game that accurately simulates bursting through a door and firing a shotgun at somebody. So if you're just going to do this with basic isometric tile sprite graphics, what you might want to do is just say there's a set probability that doing this will succeed, because the game doesn't simulate all the things that might cause this to fail. So we'll just abstract everything away and say your guy, for whatever reason, has an 87% chance of this working and he knows it. Are you going to tell him to take the decision or not? So that's just an abstraction on something. It doesn't really make any sense, and it's really unsatisfying to play as a gameplay thing, because every time the thing you don't want to happen happens, there's nothing you could have done differently, which feels very frustrating, and it feels like you're out of control of the action. Not necessarily a bad thing. You could deliberately inflict that annoyance upon the player, and of course these games do, but I put it to you, there has to be a better way. We have to move on. We have to have an XCOM game that's more like a combat puzzle, that's more like you know what's going to happen when you take an action because the world is deterministic, because that means you can have a very extended view of the battle, in that you can predict things that are going to happen and start building a strategy based on that. You can say, I can go into this room and do this, which will allow me to do this, that will cause the enemy to do this, that sort of thing, where you're planning and seeing your plan get pulled off. With RNG, just in principle, you can't do that, because you can only guarantee 0 moves ahead. So you can only think 1 move ahead. You can think, I'll try this, and then you reset your strategy based on whether it worked or whether it didn't work. So your strategy is always like one thing at a time. You're limited, basically. Or if you want to actually make a complex strategy, it's just going to be a gamble and will probably fall apart at some point. That's supposed to be part of the fun. I put it to you that it's more fun to not be like that. Or you could even go truly wild, truly modern, and make it optional. The most difficult thing to set up, but also the best, of course, as it always is. If you could make it so that, say, on easy difficulty, your weapons just always hit within their effective range so that normal people can play the game, but then on hard difficulty, it simulates things like your soldiers being terrible and there being unknown circumstances that would cause them to miss shots. That sort of thing might be more appreciated by the hardcore players who play on a more hardcore mode, this sort of thing. Modes and difficulty levels is always the solution to every game design problem. Like, that's like the golden bullet. If there's any disagreement, you just say, well, make it a mode. It's the hardest thing for the developers to do, the best thing for the players to get. Although some will argue otherwise, like the whole Dark Souls can't be easy, that sort of thing. Well, I put it to you, I'm putting to you so many things right now that is the case in something like Xenonauts. If you like RNG, you should be able to turn it on, but I think people would secretly prefer it with much of the RNG crushed out of the game. Because it's the future now, we could do something better. Although, of course, in a game like Xenonauts, which is deliberately remaking a game, which itself was deliberately remaking an even older game, that was really abstract and janky just because that's how it was in the past. That was the best that they could do back then. I guess that gives them an excuse to say, well, we're making mechanics that are a spiritual successor in an homage to mechanics that were as good as they could be in the past. even though the field has moved on, technology's moved on, software engineering is better now, it's easier to do complex things, we're not going to because the vibe would be off. Something like that. They've got that excuse they can throw out infinitely. What I'm going to do right now is stop being mad about Xenonauts 2 for 1 second. Let's focus in on something more specific. Let's find some RNG to complain about, and maybe I'll seem marginally less insane. Alright, I'm back. Let's start with a little one. Grenade launchers don't launch grenades. That's one of the weird things that took me by surprise. Grenade launchers are rocket launchers mechanically. The grenades just keep going in a straight line after you shoot them. So this is a problem because the grenade launchers are inherently inaccurate to make up for the fact they have area of effect damage. But if you miss the enemy, it's not like it lands next to them and does a bit of damage. It just flies off the screen and hits whatever's in the background, that sort of thing. And I didn't like it. I rapidly stopped using them despite liking them in principle, because they're too unreliable for that strange reason. Even if you try to shoot at the floor specifically, the shots will just sail off to ridiculously inaccurate locations because they're treated as linear line-of-sight weapons. Here's me using a grenade launcher to do something productive. We're going to blow up this wall because we saw earlier there's somebody inside. And as I rotate the camera, that's the advantage, by the way, to being in 3D. You can rotate the camera, it maintains the sprite aesthetic from all directions. But while rotating, it can show the rotation rather than just being a snap rotation as it would be with pure sprite graphics, like in something like Caesar 3, if you saw me playing that a while back. Anyway, we're here to complain about RNG and grenade launchers apparently. Grenade launchers have bad RNG, but the thing that's trying to make up for their area of effectiveness doesn't work in the game. So something's going on with grenade launchers that need to be fixed or made more like thrown grenades. The mechanics for having arced grenades already exist in the game, they just don't apply to grenade launchers. Or make them rocket launchers instead, that would probably be cooler, I suppose. Now you might have seen during some of those moments back there that during end-turn sequences, the two sides will shoot at each other without you giving orders, so there's some kind of Overwatch-like system in the game. And that's where both RNG and another thing I wanted to rant about, obfuscation, are at its heaviest. But first, I'm going to have to talk about this grenade moment again by the looks of things. I'm trying to shoot a grenade into this room because there's an alien behind a thing. We destroy the thing successfully, but you might have seen it was saying we only had a 22% chance to make that shot. Because it's telling you the RNG of like shooting the guy in the head with the grenade launcher, and because he's behind cover, it doesn't really count. What we need is the exact thing that the XCOM remake did, where it just shows you where roughly you're shooting the grenade and what the area of effect is going to be, because that's what I needed to see in that situation, that the grenade would hit the workbench he was behind. And actually what could have happened there is because I was aiming at the guy, I could have missed the guy in such a way that it went over his shoulder, so I wasn't aiming at the bench as I wanted. You can deliberately target the ground, but it doesn't like aim down at the ground, it just treats the ground as like an enemy target, and you can still quote unquote miss the ground and have the shot go off into the background as a result. Something, mad about grenades. In this situation, you can see there was actually another enemy in the room who surprised me, and then I take this Overwatch shot from that enemy. So it's time to talk about Overwatch, and the RNG does come into this, because there are various hidden actually factors that decide whether or not you can fire at enemies when you see them and vice versa. And of course that makes a massive difference. Can you enter a room with an enemy in it? There are some numbers that decide. I believe every entity has a reflex stat and an initiative stat, which is somewhere. You might be able to look them up. You can see reflexes somewhere, I seem to recall. I'm not quite sure about initiative, and of course you can't see it for the enemy. So what you can't do is guess in advance whether like running into a room will cause them to just shoot you as you open the door, other than gaining experience in running into rooms and getting shot, and eventually being like, well, they tend to be able to do it. You'll notice that, you know, it's like 20% of the time you die when you open a door, but that's too much, so you need to do something about it. And you can tell where the game wanted you to get in your headspace. They want you to be careful. They want you to pay attention to what enemies didn't move during their turn, because the way Overwatch works is unlike in the XCOM remakes, for example. You're just always on Overwatch if you have enough time to do it. So essentially, if you don't move during your turn, you're considered to have used Overwatch. That's the equivalent thing in Remake XCOM. But the issue is your inability to sort of specifically do Overwatch makes it very weak, and your inability to know if the enemy is going to do it against you makes you weak against it. I'm not quite sure what this argument I'm making is. There are multiple arguments, I suppose, I'm trying to make simultaneously. But to try and stick to RNG if we can, there is an RNG chance that when an enemy runs at you, for example, there's an RNG chance that you'll fire at them based on your reflex stat, the amount of time units you have, the enemy's initiative stat, and then there's the RNG chance after firing that you can hit them based on 1,000 different things, and then there's the RNG damage, which is another big RNG factor in the game, and that might be the thing that makes me say that this is the most RNG based game of all of these kinds of games, because RNG damage is huge in this game. You can take, I believe it's minus 50% plus 100% damage. So when you get hit by something, the amount of damage you can do is an extreme range, and obviously that range is so extreme that whether you'll die to taking a hit is very random, and there's another random chance on top of that, I think it's 25%, that you'll not die from taking an attack, and you'll fall unconscious or something instead. I think XCOM did this as well. So it's very, very hard to know what's going to happen. It's supposed to be like this, it's supposed to be random, you're supposed to be reacting each moment to the fact the battlefield situation is out of control and you don't know what you're doing. I put it to you, once again, it's time to put something to you, that at the very least, a modern new player would probably like it a bit more if it was a bit less like that. And I find that while I sort of like it in principle, I sort of like that you can't order your troops to just fire at the enemy, things like that. It's very frustrating, because this mechanic is representing an abstraction that's not shown in the game, so it feels like it's just screwing you over. Like in this exact situation we're looking at here, I can't just fire at this guy standing behind a bunch of wood, because he's considered to be behind cover, even though like my shotgun guy here has a 100% clear line of sight attack on this guy. It's aiming at the guy in the abstract. So our shotgun guy has a certain probability that he's aiming at the guy's foot, and therefore the shot is blocked. You can't just fire at them. And well, this is adding on to a different issue that I was going to rant about later, the issue of how the cover system works, or to put it another way, how there is not really a cover system. There is just something that affects the RNG of shooting. Another thing to mention, actually, while I'm thinking about it with the RNG of shooting, is that if you're in cover, all it does is deduct from the accuracy of the shooter. The cover doesn't give you much information, I suppose, about how in cover you are. So if you're, say, in cover that's considered 100% cover in the game, like you're behind the corner of a wall or something, the enemy can still shoot you, because even though it will deduct a minus 100% chance to hit, if their chance to hit is more than 100% because they're accurate for some reason, they can still hit you even if you're completely covered by the cover. It's that sort of system. It makes much more sense when the numbers are lower. So if you have a minus 50% chance to hit because of cover, it's like, yeah, you could probably just aim at the part that's not in cover and hit with 100% probability if you are accurate enough. So that's where it works. But from the perspective of a player, you can't know the enemy's chance to hit you, that sort of thing. So when you go into cover, you are guessing how much cover it provides you, and it in effect adds to the RNG. Like, you might be in cover if you hide behind something, but the enemy can still have a 100% chance to hit you as if you weren't in cover, so you don't know whether it's useful to be in cover or not in those situations. The sort of thing where the developer would say, cool, that's something you can learn by experience, isn't it? And I would say, I guess, but I think you should teach it to me or make it intuitive in some way. It feels like, in many cases, you're behind a piece of cover that gives you 100% protection and nothing should be able to hit you. But even a piece of cover that actually does reduce the chance to hit by 100% doesn't reduce it to 0, because the chance to hit you can be over 100%. So you can still die in full cover, that sort of thing, or die where you think you're out of the enemy's line of sight and it says 100% blocked, but you can get hit because like the edge of the tile you're standing on, the corner of it is visible from some perspective of the enemy. So while they can't see your character model, they're considered to be able to fire at you. There's some sort of simplification with the line of sight. Line of sight rants can be done infinitely in XCOM-like games. In this game, actually, there is height as well to take into account. There was a moment that happened in this fight where I had this sniper trying to shoot at a guy in a door. He has a 100% chance to hit a guy he can't see who is around the door frame, and a reduced chance to hit a guy who's standing in front of him because of a small fence that's like so far forwards that the fact he's on a roof should completely negate like the fence's influence on this sniper rifle shot. So, you know, you just have to battle with things like that. You just have to take the numbers and try not to question why the numbers are what they are. But still, I'd be very, very interested to see a version of this where the numbers are just always 100% or they're not even there. For example, just say your shots always hit within the effective range of the weapons, and have a fast and furious battle, like say, you know what, if you walk out in front of an enemy, the chance of them firing at you is 100%. Now you have a game. Now you're not like chancing everything, you're not just reacting to each moment, which is what they want you to do. That's what the game is like. I'm suggesting it might actually be better if that was a mode. I said the dirty word mode once again. If I could turn on Fast and Furious mode and just be like, you always fire at the enemy. If they run at you, they'll always fire if you run at them. Now you have a tactics game. Now it's like, right, smoke, blocking lines of sight, flanking, distracting the enemy by firing at them from cover from one side to make them look at me and fire back. Suddenly somebody else can see them from behind and fire at them without taking return fire, that sort of thing. And all of this only matters. All of that's only an interesting chain of things to think about if you're pretty sure it's actually going to happen. Truly, I'm out of control. I'm just venting this morning, like another day, another vent about Xenonauts. What I want to do is bring you an actual commentary of all the moves in a battle to give you an idea of how battles actually go, the sorts of things I'm trying to think about while playing, and perhaps in the process of that we'll come up with some much more constructive and less insane criticism that we can use to really piece together what's happening with Xenonauts 2. With all of the caveats we've already done left aside, let's not complain about RNG, let's not complain that it's exactly the same as Xenonauts 1. If we just take it as it is, how is it to play right now? Let's stop talking about how I want it to be different and talk about how it actually is. What we're going to be doing is this cleaner cell mission, which pops up after a while. I mentioned the cleaners before as something I thought was going to be quite interesting in the game. It's really something that's quite difficult, and I think it's actually optional as well to do this mission. Well, let's look at it anyway. We need to go and capture some guy from the organization that in my headcanon is the rival to XCOM. I think in the real canon, they're more like the Thin Men, so they're the aliens' human spies who are just preparing the ground for the invasion. So it's not quite as sneaky as I thought it was going to be. Anyway, we land, and the first thing I want to mention is line of sight. This is another thing that I suppose I could rant about, and I remember when I played Xenonauts 1, I immediately went into the game files and upped the line of sight on everything, and expanded the field of visions as well. Your soldiers have very poor eyesight, and their eyes don't move in their sockets, and I think they can't even rotate their heads independently of their body as well, which makes it very difficult to see anything. You can see like all around me, there's fog of war, like right next to my characters. And even the helicopter like doesn't provide any line of sight on the area around you land. Like you can't even look at it before getting out the helicopter. So we have these rules here about how the game's going to restrict what you know to make it more difficult. And it's just unimmersive. So I think increasing the field of view to say 160 degrees, I think it's 90 at the moment, something real low, would be real nice. Check me out here dying to this Overwatch. So there's an example of how the sort of unindicated Overwatch works. Because that guy hadn't moved in his previous turn, I don't know if I could have known that or not, I don't remember, but that guy was quote-unquote on Overwatch, whereas other enemies won't be, like the other guy you'll see me shooting at in a second. And I think there would be some value in indicating on the UI, if your troops know that the guy in your line of sight did something during their turn, like some sort of indication that maybe they don't have their time units there. You're just supposed to do that yourself, like you as the player are meant to do that and remember it, but I tend not to. So I'm simply asking for an aid here. Can we hire a second guy in the command staff to just keep track on a notepad of which enemies have time units and tell me during my turn? But make that a UI element, essentially. Well, anyway, there was an example of us killing a guy who didn't have Overwatch, so it was free for me to just shoot at him from the front because we saw him shooting at us during his turn, so he probably couldn't do it again during our turn, that sort of thing. There's a clear example of how the grenade launcher thing works. Our shot landed about 3 times further away than the target, off in the fog of war somewhere after I tried to target the ground in front of him. Don't know what's up with grenade launchers, something needs to be done. Here's a nice opportunity to use my little rover vehicle as cover. I think it counts as cover. At the very least, units tend to count as cover for each other, and that's one of the big XCOM techniques, is you can have one guy stand in front of a second guy, and the second guy is considered to be in cover because the first guy is cover. And if the first guy has a shield, that's all the better, but you could also do it with just a guy with heavy armor or loads of health even, something like that. It's one of the things that I learned about Xenonauts from the Xenonauts 1 game manual. Xenonauts 2 does come with an in-game tutorial, but it doesn't really explain enough. It actually has, if I recall correctly, one of the tutorials like in Steel Division 2, where it explicitly says that it's told you everything in the tutorial, and it completely hasn't. Just an absolute new player nightmare. If you're not going to tutorialize everything, at least don't say that you have. Say, there's plenty more to learn, but there's no time, you'll have to learn it on the battlefield, or something like that. Don't be like, you now know everything you need to defeat the alien invasion, which I think is what it does in this game's tutorial. Something, something, something. I was supposed to be doing a play-by-play in this commentary, but I just can't stop ranting. There are too many different things you can rant about with Xenonauts. I had the same problem with Star Sector recently, where every single thing I had some thought about that I just had to spit out. Well, anyway, we've done it. We've defeated that guy up there after failing to shoot around the corner with my machine gunner earlier. I actually did want to mention something about that. The machine gunner missed all of their really close range shots, and that looks really unsatisfying. But I think it's more fair than it looks. The game is being held back by its simplistic presentation. Because if you run and then fire, you're using a different kind of firing. Your guns have different fire modes, like an accurate fire or an aimed shot, and a burst fire or unaimed shots, where the animation and the visual look on the screen is the same, but just the numbers involved will be different. So visually, my character stood there, turned to the enemy, raised their gun, had 10 seconds to aim at them, and then fires. But what that represents in the game is me running up to that corner and just blind firing around it without really looking, as soon as physically possible, and then going down into cover. Because that's not shown on the screen, it feels more unfair when doing that is really inaccurate and it just looks like you're missing at point blank range, because what's being portrayed is the characters very clearly being able to shoot each other at really short range and just missing. So you feel like you're being screwed over, but what the game is trying to represent is actually more fair. So it gives the impression of being less fair than it looks. Here I did a freeze frame to check out this sort of cheeky line of sight, one of the many things that makes working out how safe you are in the game difficult, because the isometric perspective messes with things as well. There is this effect where you can shoot along the seams, so to speak, of tiles, which mainly affects shooting completely vertically or completely horizontally. That's when it's at its hardest to visually see what's in line of sight. Because here, it kind of looks like maybe the corner of the red container or the corner of the concrete wall would be blocking the line of sight in the completely eastward direction. But you can shoot along the diagonal, where it's hard to imagine, but you might be able to visualize there being a sort of 0 pixel wide gap, at the points where the tiles are connecting, where... So if the red tile is considered to be blocking line of sight completely and the concrete tile is considered to block it completely as well, since it has that thing on top of it, you can still see past both of them completely because there is that 1 pixel gap in between. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Basically, because the game uses squares instead of another shape, The line of sight calculations will occasionally be really weird if you're shooting along a diagonal that goes along all of the corners of squares, because things that are touching the corners of those squares that should be blocking line of sight in a rational sort of way aren't considered to be blocking the corner of their tile. So things like the corner of a shipping container or the corner of these walls, which I wrote about earlier in that caption I put on the screen, they don't block line of sight when it feels like they should, but to some extent this is also just because of the lack of a cover system. I mentioned this already. I think I didn't emphasize this enough actually earlier in my rant when I checked back. Because you can't quote-unquote take cover, you can't use things like corners and doors very strategically. In order to take cover, you have to stand one tile back from the edge, and here in this mission you can see me doing that. I set up where nobody stands at the edge of the entrance to this lot, the place I'm now putting this guy actually, because that's not considered to be in cover from the perspective of anywhere like roughly in the right quadrant of the screen now. If they can see any of this tile and the tile extends back from the cover a bit, then you are visible to the tile that can see that tile. So for example now, the enemy that's still alive has a full line of sight shot on the guy I just put on the corner of that concrete, because from there they can probably see the lower back corner of the tile that guy was crouching on. This is very hard to do just pointing at my monitor. I need to stop and do like diagrams, but the entire point I'm just trying to make here is that the line of sight abstractions make it difficult, and the fact you can't take cover only adds to that. You would expect it to be more like in XCOM, where if you're up against a wall, the rest of the tile isn't where you are. You are up against the wall, and the enemy has to have an extreme angle on you to be able to see you, like flattened up against the wall, something like that. That's what I think intuitively the mechanic should be. But in this case there is no mechanic, so being in cover is very incidental. Your characters aren't using the cover around them. It just might be that the cover blocks line of sight. It's kind of like playing an old school FPS or something in that regard. Like, there is cover, you can use it, but you can't, say, like crouch up against it or do cover stuff or fire from cover in such a way that only 5% of your cross section is visible to the enemy, and they should almost have no chance of hitting you because it's just like your hand and gun pointing around the edge of something. It's more like you're fully visible if you can shoot around the cover, or if the cover blocks you completely, they just can't see you and they won't fire at you. Well, we need something here, and this is one of the things that I might have expected them to change as we go from XCOM 1 to 2. Some system for using doors, for using edges of buildings, for using this exact scenario here, where most Lemis can't really use that corner she's on because she is still visible to the enemy. Fortunately, I sacrificed my robot instead and we didn't get fired at, and then we just made that wild attack to finish off the enemy. This leaves us, I guess, if we combine this with some of the ranting from earlier, with the two big features that Xenonauts doesn't have that I expected them to put into Xenonauts 2. Those being ability to use cover in the exact same vein as the XCOM remakes by Firaxis did, and the ability to explicitly overwatch in the exact same vein as the XCOM remakes. Yes, I'm very influenced by those games, it seems. It makes sense to me to be able to tell your soldiers to go on to Overwatch and have that be distinct from them being idle, especially because of the tactical possibilities, which XCOM doesn't use, the remake, so Xenonauts could swoop in and take this crown here by saying, use Overwatch on this location. That's the big thing that you always need to be able to do, but can't. So for example, have somebody who can see an enemy say, Overwatch on that enemy, and this would massively reduce the amount of time units it takes to fire at them if the enemy comes out of cover, because you're already aiming at them. That sort of system, which is then countered by being fired upon yourself or becoming suppressed or something like that. I would expect that to be possible because of how useful it would be, how you almost always need to do something like that in firefights, but you're more relying on the hope that if the enemy comes out of cover, if your guys have just been left to do nothing, they might fire at them. But that leaves you with the conundrum in an average combat situation of not knowing, should I use my turn to fire at the enemy because there's probably a chance of hitting them, or should I move somewhere else, something like that, or should I just sit still and hope that my troops will fire at the enemy if the enemy runs out of cover? I think that latter option is probably the safer one, but it tends to be very difficult to know whether you should do that, and it feels wrong, I suppose, because you can't tell your soldiers to do it. They won't always do it, and the soldiers have different reflex stats, so some of them won't think to fire because it takes them 10 seconds to think about things, that sort of stuff. Well, you just wish for more control, or I wish for more control, and I'm going to put it straight to you that the game would be better and more people would like it if generally that was put under player control. And the exact same thing for how cover works, and whether a troop is leaning up against something in their tile in order to dramatically restrict who can see that tile, or who can see them in the tile, and for it not to be just based on the tile itself when calculating line of sight. It's one of these things where, since they remade the game in Unity and stuff and made it all full 3D, you might hope it's going to have more detailed line of sight, where it's doing things like tracking the positions of the characters' heads and their eyes in order to determine line of sight, or determining where they can put their weapon or something. We saw an example earlier where I had a sniper crouched behind a wall whose weapon just went through the wall, and the character couldn't see over that wall without standing up, which is a big deal because it costs time units to stand up, so we can't abstract that away. But that was considered to be able to see through the wall because reasons. And you might think that with the whole Unity thing that could be simulated more accurately, but it doesn't, perhaps because they were remaking Xenonauts, where it also doesn't work like that because it was based on an older technology, an older setup. It's hard to say. Now, I've just been ranting continuously and not really talking about what's happening, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do that even more. We're getting owned here. Susan Smokes a lot, somehow getting obliterated despite theoretically being in cover there, being crouched behind that set of boxes or planks of wood or something that's just in the street for whatever reason. If you sort of think about the line of sight, there's almost no cross-section of that person available to see from the direction the enemy were firing at me from, so I would have hoped I wouldn't get hit 3 times at long range. They're only firing with submachine guns as well. Well, this is the thing I wanted to rant about, and I know this is a good thing to rant about actually, because in the patch note that I referenced earlier, the developers have acknowledged this problem, and this is the difficulty of certain missions where it gives you time limits. This is one of those games, like XCOM, like Xenonauts 1 even, where the optimal way to play is known, but I never do it. Why? Because it's really boring. What is the optimal way to play? Well, it's the old classic, you move 1 tile. That's it. Every turn, every character moves 1 tile. This is the optimal way to play, especially because you can't activate Overwatch. The less you move, the more you have activated Overwatch to some extent, the more probability that you're in Overwatch. So what you want to do is move a single tile every turn and hope the enemy walk at you, come into your line of sight and get shot by your Overwatch every single turn, because if you move more than that, you're giving the enemy the chance to do that against you, and you have fewer time units after moving to have your soldier potentially do something or sit there and use it for Overwatch. Now, realistically, moving 1 tile might be a bad idea because of cover, so a less pedantic and facetiously put rule is you should move the minimum possible distance every turn. That's the safest way to play, it's the best way to play, and this is a game that very much emphasizes playing safely because it is a positive feedback loop game. A comment I made earlier in this video that if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's going to be a problem basically, so I'll quickly explain that it's a game where what happens to you influences heavily what's going to happen in the future. So you have to succeed because every failure comes with a laundry list of other failures that will happen to you later because of each failure. Every time you lose a character, the probability you'll lose another character increases, and that just stacks up and up and up throughout the entire campaign. Because the characters train up over time and they get better and better the more you use them, every time you lose somebody, the probability that you can finish the game goes down, and you can get stuck in soft failure states and things like that long before the failure actually appears on the screen. This can be frustrating, and knowing it can be frustrating. Knowledge is the problem here. If you don't know you're in a positive feedback loop game, it might be more fun to be like, it's okay that I missed that shot. But when you're a true min-maxer, you're like, damn, I missed that shot. That could cause me to lose the entire campaign. And it sounds overblown, but the more positive feedback loopy the game is, the higher the probability of that actually being true is as well. What the probability is unknown, which is part of why freaks like me find this kind of game design a bit unsatisfying. Well, anyway, the point I was going to make is that because of that, playing as safely and conservatively as possible is extra rewarded, and that's why it's so optimal to just do as little as possible during each of your turns. Why am I talking about all of this? Because one of the quote-unquote developments that Xenonauts 2 brings is in these cleaner missions there's a time limit, or a soft time limit I suppose, which makes things much more difficult. Check out that shot I just fired. I thought I'd be firing through the window. My character put their gun up against the wall and just shot the wall until it fell down. I don't know what's going on. More issues with line of sight, with cover, with control over characters. It's not happening for me. The point is, if I can make it, if I can get there to the point, we're struggling for the point, we're digging for the point, we're sticking our machine gun up against the wall and firing, hoping it will blast through to the point, is that, with the time limits, you can't play optimally, and in terms of balancing, the time limits are extremely harsh, and also one of the very first missions you do in the game is one of these really harsh time limits. I did say it's only a soft time limit, and by that I mean the game will just continuously spawn enemies. I think you get 2 to 4 enemies per turn being added to the map every turn you're over the turn limit, which is 7 turns. And in this mission, where we're supposed to hunt down a VIP, long before ever seeing the VIP, we've gone over the turn limit. So from now on, extra enemies are continuously spawning, and we've seen earlier they're spawning somewhere up and right of me. So my only hope is to guess that the target is up and left of me, which may well be the case, run in that direction, and just have somebody try to hold off or suppress the reinforcements so we can get to the VIP. And the very first mission in the game, or the second mission I think it was, where you fight the cleaners early on, we saw that earlier, also has the same rule, although there I think it's like 5 turns, it's even more strict. I can't remember quite, but what I do remember is in the patch notes, one of the very first patches of the game, like the day after it released, was them making this less harsh. So unfortunately that happened after me playing this because this was in the beta. But they made it so I think the enemies spawn every 5 turns instead. I think it might have been every 2 turns originally and they switched it to every 5 turns, something like that, so that it's less annoying. But to me, that wasn't the problem. The problem is just that the time limit is so strict that if you just sprinted across the entire map, you still might not even see the objective before the time limit was over. And of course you can't just sprint across the entire map, because as I said, the best way to play is to move 1 tile at a time. So it's interesting to shake that up by throwing in a time limit to try and force you to play dangerously, but I think that would be much more fun in the fast and furious mode I was proposing, where playing fast and dangerously is rewarding and it's tactical and strategic and you know what's going to happen to some extent, and therefore can strategize. Well, it was very difficult for me, both in that first cleaner mission and this one, and we can see both from the patch notes talking about this and a later patch note where they pledged to change the time limit system again because I presume they were getting a storm of complaints about it, is that it's too much. I suppose they wanted to innovate, to do something different by doing this. Like, this is proposed as the difference with Xenonauts 1, but it's just antithetical to how Xenonauts is best played, the whole time limits thing. That's probably the point, but it just makes it extremely unfun. Not that playing it optimally would be particularly fun either because of how long it takes. That reminds me, by the way, as we finally find the VIP and realise the probability of me getting in here is about 0 because the enemy's reinforcements are also spawning behind the VIP room, there's even more of them back there. There's another rant I want to make, so I'm just going to throw that at you right now. Essentially, where the gameplay is going from here is that I decided to commit everything to the attack because I'd sort of privately thought if this mission fails I'll quit the campaign, and seeing so early on that the probability of success was like 0. I thought, let's just see, could we ever defeat the VIP? Like, even if it takes 3 times as long as the time limit the game gave us, would it even be possible? That sort of thing. Just for critique purposes, this is like way, way too harsh to have at the beginning of a positive feedback loopy game. And there's another downside to our poor line of sight, or poor field of vision. We didn't know that guy was standing there in the road, even though I've got somebody looking at them, I think. Anyway, I have to step out of cover, fire like this, and step back in. Along the way, we discovered there's another person standing there as well. Luckily, I have the time units to go back into cover. It's all just an absolute disaster. Anyway, the thing I wanted to say, other than that this campaign is going to be lost because of this battle, is The next rant point. When I first started playing Xenonauts 2, there was one other innovation that I didn't think would be in the game, but I hoped for, so I'm going to tell you what it is. And it's the innovation that I was pleasantly surprised by in a different XCOM game, XCOM Chimera Squad, which I've got a video on this channel, where one of the big things I liked about it is that it's just a whole bunch of fights. You don't have to move around. One of the things that wore me down about XCOM, I'm literally losing my voice ranting about this. One of the things that wore me down in XCOM is that one-tile movement thing. So in the first XCOM remake game, it had the same thing where moving one tile was the optimal thing to do, and it made the missions real slow if you were trying to play some sort of difficult scenario. And what I wanted was there to be an XCOM game that didn't have the movement phase, which took up so much of the game and was so un-action-packed in retrospect. Like, it's this tense thing where usually nothing happens and there's no payoff to it. So, XCOM Chimera Squad surprised me pleasantly by being a game where it just puts you in fights where you're in the line of sight of the enemy, and if you kill all the enemies you can see, it just cuts to some other moment where again you're like in the line of sight of the enemy. It's just cutting between encounters with the enemy pods with no movement mechanics whatsoever. So there's no opportunity to do careful Overwatch stuff, but I welcomed that because I didn't like that part of the game, because it's sort of boring, it's inevitable, and it's another case where playing at your best is really slow and boring and annoying, and I thought I just don't want this to be the best way to play. Just make it so I can't even do it, then I don't have to worry about how boring it would be to play well, that sort of thing. We're getting absolutely annihilated right here in this mission. And in this game, the very first thing I thought when I started playing the first mission is, oh yeah, you have to like spend ages gradually moving out of the helicopter, looking around, like manually getting your characters to turn their bodies because they can't turn their heads, to know even the terrain around the helicopter. Interestingly, in the loading screens, I noticed the helicopter is portrayed as having cameras on it, and I thought, can we get some pictures of the environment as we're landing or something so that the map isn't completely blacked out at the beginning? It could be fog of war, but at least let us know the terrain. Like, we should know this. Do we not have any satellites? This is supposed to be happening in the 2000s. Well, anyway, that was another thing that potentially could be an innovation. It probably wouldn't work with Xenonauts at all, but some system where moving around is less of the game and trying to out-combat the enemy, doing like the actual combat tactics, is more of the game. That's what I hoped for, because that's the thing I think is most interesting. It's the most impactful thing as well, in that it progresses the game more to be doing that, so it feels more useful. And I want to avoid a scenario where playing really well means playing slowly, it means taking 45 minutes to do a combat encounter, that sort of thing, because the payoff isn't worth it. Like, I'd rather just say like, you just get the same reward, but it takes 7 minutes, that sort of thing. It's just a run and gun affair. And originally I would dismiss my own complaints here as just being like, that's just your opinion, man, like you clearly don't want to play this game. But more and more, playing more games that are like what I'm talking about recently, it makes me think that this would just be a more popular thing overall than the system we've got here. And because Xenonauts 2 has taken the time to be a remake of Xenonauts 1, there's a missed opportunity, since they didn't need to make another Xenonauts 1. They had the opportunity to make something real different here and say, well, if you don't like that, there's still Xenonauts 1. People would say, oh, but I just wanted you to make a better version of Xenonauts 1, but now we're in the timeline where they tried to do that and it doesn't work. So let's go back in time. Another really useful game design critique suggestion. All we need to do is change the timelines, and guys, we'll have some much better games available. I think this is, like, by a long shot, one of the worst videos I've ever made, and I'm going to blame Xenonauts 2, okay? Xenonauts 2, you got me mad. Like, every frame got me mad about something. Like, every movement is a disappointment, because it's like, oh, I shouldn't be moving this far, and if you move a little bit, it's like, oh, it's going to take so long, I wish I could just move further. And when you miss a shot, oh, I missed the shot. When you hit a shot, oh, it did 10 damage. Why? Last time it did 35 damage, and then you realize it's because of that damage RNG thing, and, like, you throw out some smoke to block line of sight, it doesn't block line of sight. Okay, well, never mind then. You stand at a corner hoping to sort of peek out and shoot during your next turn. No, you're considered to already being standing around the corner in the game's cover logic, so you just get shot during the enemy turn. Just thing after thing happens. And we reach this situation where it's a timed mission, it's extremely difficult to even find the objective before the time limit runs out, and there's just like a sense of no hope. I don't know, it probably a setup where the game developers, who are extremely good, know some sort of exploit techniques and can deal with this scenario, set this up like this will be a challenge, but it's just way beyond a challenge for a normal player. That's one of these things that I saw people talking about recently in a random game design discussion. Game developers always overestimate how good players are at their games. They always make them a bit too hard for new players because it's just so difficult to know how little people from the outside know about your game. So it's, for a general audience at least, if you're releasing a game to non-hardcore gamers, you really need to be as patronizing as possible. Go way beyond your comfort zone in how patronizing you're being, because it will pay off in people liking the game more. And the people that don't like it, well, if you've been very clever, you could have made it a mode so that it doesn't do that. You know, the old turn off tutorial tips thing. We're getting absolutely blasted by the VIP here, trying to approach him, trying to do anything, trying to open doors and stuff. It's just getting us blasted constantly. There's an infinite number of enemies to the left and right of the screen. We're playing some Xenonauts 2 with the timed missions mode. This needs to be turn-offable for sure. You should even have just made it more like Xenonauts 1, where this doesn't happen. Yes, the man who complains that it's too much like Xenonauts 1 wanted you to make it more like Xenonauts 1. You've come this far. Why did you add this thing that makes it worse? That sort of complaint. And I remember glancing at the Steam reviews, like on the first day when this game came out, and that was pretty much the sentiment I was seeing, because there were probably loads of Xenonauts 1 veterans lined up to play Xenonauts 2. They went in on the first day of early access and we're just like, wait, what? It's exactly the same? Like, their mind was also blown in the same way after all these years of development as well. We have to leave, we have to get out of here. True for the characters in this scenario, and true for everybody who is somehow still listening to me talking. I'm supposed to talk every morning to warm up my voice. Today, I've just done it to ruin my voice. I'm just screaming about Xenonauts 2. Am I still going to play the entire game? Yes. Am I probably going to make a massive video about it? Yes. But I just thought I'd get this first hour of what would have been in that video off my chest. Rant, rant, rant. Look at how killed we're getting. We just got shot through a couple of pieces of cover. That was good, wasn't it? Line of sight, cover, line of sight, Overwatch. Field of vision, an understated rant point. Field of vision. Why can't our guys move their eyes without it costing time units or something? Does it take that long to get 170-degree field of vision? I feel like if I hold my arm out to my right now, I can kind of tell that it's there. Even if I'm not looking at it, it's sort of magical. I don't know, maybe I'm just better than the guys in the XCOM universe. You know, you could even make a mechanic out of this by actually showing the enemy's field of vision to make it really stealthy, something like that. So have everything have limited field of vision, but have field of vision be more of a mechanic. I presume in this sort of game, the enemy probably has unlimited map vision because it's easier to program the AI if they do. It's that sort of thing where they just won't tell you what the AI knows, but the AI knows everything, and you're left to get the sense that maybe you're playing against a fair scenario. You probably aren't. And because it's the kind of game where, of course, every loss for you has massive consequences, but losses for the enemy are inconsequential because their characters just spawn at their max level and stuff. They don't need to train characters or progress anything in a positive feedback loop like you do. They don't have the generic disadvantage of being in a war where you only have a very limited amount of resources, which is, of course, another rant one can level against the entire XCOM Xenonauts universe thing. Hey, can we get more than 20 guys to solve this problem? Like, in the text of the game, in the lore, it actually says the reason you can't deploy more than 9 soldiers is because your helicopter isn't big enough. Firstly, it is. The model of the helicopter could easily fit like 20 people in it. It could even have a pilot if you're feeling very generous. But you know what? I reckon the world can rustle up more than one goddamn helicopter to stop an alien invasion. They could probably rustle up somebody who's really good at shooting and stuff like that. And what about that robot we had earlier? Why don't we make 1 million of those? Is there a factory somewhere? Can we get that going, guys? One day, a complete XCOM conceptual remake will come about, where it's more like What would humanity do if they had to unite to fight the aliens? Like, what would the world government be like? What sort of techniques would they use? Why don't we make a game out of that? This is the sort of thing I would like to see from indie spin-off XCOM-likes, and perhaps the sort of thing that would have been very fun to have in Xenonauts 2, but it's a remake of Xenonauts 1, so we're not going to get fun things like that. We don't get airstrikes, we don't get tanks, we don't deploy a company of troops, we deploy 3 people. We've got like Sally the cleaner, we've given her a grenade launcher, she's got a 20% chance to hit something 3 feet in front of her. That's good enough. We simply don't have anyone better. And by the way, here's $5 million. Stop the aliens. I don't know, we can't afford more than $5 million. Even in the 2000s. Why don't we make it 5 billion? Just write 5 billion on the UI and I'd be less mad about it. Look, Xenonauts 2. Surprisingly disappointing. Supposedly it's going to be made better, and that's the plan. That's the overall game plan, that it will one day be better than Xenonauts 1, but it's obviously going to be very similar, so why? Why did this happen? And I mean that in the most abstract possible sense. Why did any of this happen? Goodbye.